Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second State of Energy Research Conference, hosted here in my location at Monash. And I'd like to, first of all, call on Tony Garvey to give us a welcome to country, and then I'll move on to the next session. So please, Uncle Tony, he's here to give us a welcome to the lands of the Wurundjeri people.
Thank you very much, Ariel, for that warm invitation. Just like to thank you and the crew for inviting us here today. It's important for our culture. I'd just like to start off with saying Wurundjeri to everyone. So Wurundjeri in the Wurundjeri language means welcome. So welcome to all Indigenous and non-Indigenous people here today. Also, just like to say I'm very proud and honoured to be speaking on behalf of my people, the Wurundjeri people, Wurrung, and I am also a part of the Wandin family. The Wurundjeri people are also a part of the Kulin Nation. So Kulin means man. And in the Kulin Nation, there were 5 language groups. There was the Wadawurrung to the west, the Coorong, who were the westerly neighbours to the Wadawurrung, Tanarong to the northeast, Bunurong to the southwest, and the Wurrung of the Wurundjeri territory that we stand on here today. The Wurundjeri lies within the cities of Melbourne. It extends from the mountains of the Great Dividing Range, south to the Yarra River, west to the Werribee River, and east to Mount Baw Baw. The Wurundjeri people, they have a social totem. It is Bunjil, the eagle. Bunjil represents spiritual powers throughout many parts of Australia. Bunjil taught all the laws about life, behaviour and ceremonies to make sure that our culture would continue for all walks of life throughout Australia. Bunjil is referred to as the creator of mankind. Bunjil created great people from the land, and that is why we call the land our mother, or the mother of creation. Never can the land be taken away. The land will always belong to Aboriginal people. We are part of the land, and the land is part of us. Our story is similar to yours. Yours is by your chosen faith. Ours is by the dream time. We both have creators and beliefs, and ours is Bunjil. It is a traditional custom of the Australian Aboriginal communities to be asked and to give permission for people to enter their land. And today you have now joined with me to honour the spirits of my ancestors, past, present, and merging, who have nurtured this land for over 60,000 years, and we as the custodians of the land offer you a hearty welcome to the land and hope that together as citizens of this beautiful country, we can build, develop and unite stronger nations for all people. And finally, I'd just like to close in my Wurrung language, which is Wurundjeri, Wandun, Wurundjeri, Balak, Yemen, Kumbibik, which means you're most welcome to the land of the Wurundjeri people. Once again, thank you very much for inviting us here today. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uncle Tony. Really appreciate that welcome. And in the interest of time, I won't address the conference just yet. I will now introduce Professor Margaret Gardner here with a recorded message to open the conference. Professor Margaret Gardner is the Vice-Chancellor, of course, of Monash University. So please cue the video from our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Margaret Gardner.
Hello. Climate change threatens the fabric of our planet, our society, and the quality of the air, water, and biodiversity that sustains us. The pursuit of net zero emissions and a sustainable future requires urgent and persistent action from all levels of government, industry, institutions, and individuals. After the world gathered for COP26 in Glasgow last month, the imperative to accelerate our action to mitigate climate change has become even clearer. While significant progress has been made in putting the world on the path to 1.5 degrees through new policies and technology, much work needs to be done. In light of this, it's opportune to recognise the leading role the research sector can play in addressing this challenge. Many of the solutions we need are still not available off the shelf. While wind and solar electricity generation have won the race against other sources of electricity generation, young and old, we still do not have all the answers. How do we progressively integrate renewable and disruptive technologies into a power grid that was built for fossil fuels? How will people's decisions and expectations affect the pace and scale of the energy transition? What energy market design will serve consumers best, while at the same time accelerating the uptake of renewables? How can green hydrogen and its derivatives, such as ammonia, help make the entire global supply chain and transport sectors carbon-free? The questions that need answering keep coming. The research sector, including universities such as Monash and research agencies such as CSIRO, is more critical than ever to the future needs of Australian and global society. I'm honoured to open this landmark conference hosted by the Monash Energy Institute. This conference was launched in 2019 and held for the second time this year. It brings together Australia's most active energy transition researchers. We need our research to not only support the 2050 net zero target, but also, more importantly, the 2030 target, which is a 50% emissions reduction below 2020 levels. There isn't a moment to lose, and I trust that this conference will help extend our research ambitions in support of climate change mitigation through an accelerating energy transition. At Monash, we're proud to be a leader in taking action against climate change. In 2017, we made a landmark commitment as the first Australian university to commit to net zero emissions by 2030 through our Net Zero initiative. And Monash is on target to meet 100% of our electricity needs from renewable sources by 2030. This includes a large on-site solar program, the Murrawarra wind farm, a major switch from natural gas to renewable electricity, and large-scale energy efficiency retrofits. In our new strategic plan, Impact 2030, in setting our direction for the next decade, we will address global challenges, and climate change is one of the most important, and one of the most important for the benefit of our communities. The research sector is well positioned to tackle this global challenge. I'm excited to see the excellent work being done by the Australian Council of Learned Academies on the Australian Energy Transition Research Plan, which is being led by our first keynote speaker, Drew Clarke. Drew Clarke is both this plan's architect and chair of the Australian Energy Market Operator. He's well placed to guide the Australian energy transition research community to support speedier energy transitions. The magnitude of this challenge, however, requires collaboration. It's not just researchers. I trust that this 2021 State of Energy Research Conference, organised by the Energy Research Institute's Council for Australia, will enable increased collaboration between researchers, industry and governments across Australia. I welcome you to this important conference and very much look forward to seeing the work of this community make even more impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. It really is an important and exciting time to be here. And before I introduce Mr. Drew Clarke, Chair of the Australian Energy Transition Plan and Chair of Australian Energy Market Operator, I just wanted to take the opportunity to say a few things and thank a few people before we get on with the conference proper. So first of all, again, thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Monash, for providing support through the Monash Energy Institute, which is, of course, also my institute, and our staff and facilities. And so I wanted to welcome everybody to the ERICA second State of Energy Research Conference in 2021. The first one was held at the Australian National University, chaired by Professor Ken Baldwin from ANU in 2019. Fortunately, we were able to do that in person. Unfortunately, this year, circumstances were not so favorable, but we are very heartened that a lot of people came online today. So the community of research industry partners that are gathered here today represent hope and dedication to the most urgent and critical challenges facing humanity to date. ERICA acknowledge the excellent work done by the Australian Council of Learned Academies on the Australian Energy Transition Research Plan, led by our first keynote speaker, Drew Clarke. Honored that so many researchers, both early career and experienced, have agreed to share their research during SoERC2021, as well as to have industry leaders share their hope for the growth of a vibrant and collaborating energy community. The future of global society and its well-being is in your hands, in our hands. And I just wanted to also particularly thank a few people. The SoERC team, led by Mara Jorgovic here at the Monash Energy Institute, Nancy van Niffenhofer and Larissa Teterovkova, and the subcommittee, which included Ken, Peter Ashworth, Greg Morrison, and Kitty, and Danny Alexander from ANU, from various universities, Danny Alexander from UTS as well. So thank you very much. And now I'd like to welcome Mr. Drew Clarke, non-executive independent chairman of the AEMO Board of Directors, who will today update us on the ACOLA Australian Energy Transition Research Plan. Welcome, Drew.
Well, thank you, Ariel, and thank you very much for the invitation to open this State of Energy Research Conference. I'm speaking today on Ngunnawal land, and I thank Tony for his welcome to country down there in Melbourne. As you've mentioned, I wear a number of hats in the energy sector, but today I'm talking as chair of the steering committee for the Australian Energy Transition Research Plan, which operates under the auspices of ACOLA, the Australian Council of Learned Academies. So my focus will be on the state of the ACOLA research plan. I'd like to acknowledge my steering committee, Sue Richardson, Bruce Godfrey, Libby Robin, Ken Baldwin and Fran Baum, representing the 5 Australian Learned Academies, and also the sponsors for our work, ARENA, CSIRO and NERA. So the presentation I'll run through, I'll give some background on the research plan, talk about the research priorities, research funding, research translation, and just outline the next steps in this ACOLA project. So first, some background. Well, the origin of this research plan was in fact the first State of Energy Research Conference at ANU in 2019. After that, we made a pitch to ACOLA, the 5 academies, and they agreed to take on the project and secured financial support from our 3 sponsors. During 2020, we undertook extensive consultation with energy researchers, research users, and research funders about what they wanted to see in a research plan. And we published our first report in June this year, which outlined the policy case for the research plan and a set of initial research priorities. The framework for the plan is quite straightforward. First proposition, the energy transition is large, complex, and has significant risks and opportunities. Second proposition, research can help achieve a successful transition. And a successful transition is not just fast, it's also just, and it ensures that the opportunities are realised and the risks are managed. To be impactful, research needs to therefore be focused on the priority research questions. It needs to be funded at a level commensurate with the urgency and importance of the task. And it needs to be translated to have impact on policymakers, on industry, and on the community. And of course, that's a dynamic process. It's not a set and forget. But just in the last 6 months since we published our first report, there have been some significant developments, partly in the context of the recent COP at Glasgow. First, all 9 Australian governments are now committed to net zero emissions by 2050. And that certainly assists the policy environment for this work. The Commonwealth has published its second low emission technology statement and announced a number of new funding programs. And there is a new policy focus on research commercialisation, which will have some impact on the energy sector. There is all welcome developments, but by no means are we done. So let me turn and talk a little about the research priorities from our June 2021 publication. To put those in context, the consultation that we undertook through 2020 resulted in 4 key findings that helped us frame our research priorities. Firstly, the Australian research effort in this field is fragmented and lacks a coherent framework. Second, many of the research questions are uniquely Australian. While international research can help in many areas, there are many questions that only Australia can answer. Third, the Australian energy research sector is strong in the technology areas, indeed outstanding in many respects in the technology areas. But as a proportion, we're relatively light on the social sciences. In shorthand, we're long on STEM, short on HASS. And finally, that the effort of the community as a whole is not commensurate with the scale and urgency of the task. We identified 3 research themes in our first report. I'll just run through the scope of those quickly. First, energy system dynamics. This comprises the technologies, the transition pathways, and the system integration challenges. Second, the social engagement dynamics. This comprises policy and regulation, communication and engagement, and social license and participation. And third, transition dynamics. This comprises governance, risks, and the role of industry. Our first report identified 27 high-level research questions, each identified as either urgent, we need to know the answer now, or strategic, we're going to need it soon and we better start the research now. These were identified as the research priorities, or if you like, focusing on gaps in the current Australian energy transition research agenda. Let me just speak briefly on examples, 3 example questions, one from each of those themes. Within the system dynamic theme, how do we engineer the grid to integrate renewable energy, distributed energy, storage, transmission, and flexible demand, and then add sector coupling? This is a big power systems engineering research agenda. The Global Power System Transition Consortium has recently published a research agenda, and its development was led by AEMO and CSIRO, along with a number of universities. So the agenda is there, but there's a lot of research to be done. In the social dynamics theme, how do we obtain and retain the social license for new energy infrastructure in affected communities and the transition of energy infrastructure in communities with a strong fossil fuel basis? This is around renewable energy zones, transmission development, and areas such as the Hunter and Illawarra, where the New South Wales Energy Roadmap is focusing on this problem. And third, in the area of transition dynamics, what changes are needed to governance and institutional models for the energy systems and markets of the future, particularly what governance models are going to work through this highly disruptive phase that we're in at present. All of our current governance models and institutional structures were developed before the transition really started. Now, each of these three example questions have uniquely Australian contexts. And of course, many of them across all 27 that we identified are interrelated and are best addressed through an interdisciplinary approach. Since we published our first report, ACOLA has been working on review papers for each of those three themes. Each of these papers comprises a literature review, what do we currently know about these research questions, and a more granular specification of the priority research questions. Those papers are in advanced draft stage now. Turning to research funding. Is Australian energy transition research adequately funded? Well, that's a rhetorical question. If I was to run the poll in this audience, I'm pretty confident I'd know the answer. But from a public policy perspective, what is adequate funding for any research area? How do you go about determining that? Now, research funding includes funding for university research, funding for SoERC, funding for government programs such as ARENA, and funding for industry and community research programs. The best data set we can see to start looking at this problem is actually one published by the International Energy Agency that publishes research data, energy research data from each of its member countries, that is, from the OECD. So that data set enables some comparative analysis. In the period from 2004 to 2019, Australia has slipped to last in that league table by the simple metric of research and development dollars per unit of GDP. That metric is certainly powerful, but it's not the only indicator of what we're doing. And I think there are some significant structural issues in the IEA database around what exactly each country reports, and some potential sources of distortion, such as those countries that have a very large nuclear sector. But nonetheless, it's an important data set, and there are some important messages in there. We're expecting country submissions up to June 21 to be available in February next year, and ACOLA will be publishing an analysis of that most recent IEA data. But I think more work needs to be done to understand the stock and flow of Australian energy research funding. Turning to research translation. So if we're in a world where Australian energy research was indeed focused on the most critical research questions, and it was adequately funded, how do we then ensure that the research outcomes have the intended impact on policymakers, that is government, on industry and investors, the private sector, and on communities, households and citizens, that is on society? Now, as this audience understands all too well, research translation is not just an energy issue. It's been a contentious public policy question for quite some time. But much of the policy and reform focus has been on STEM sciences commercialisation, where the impact is measured in jobs, companies, economic growth, etc. Much less of the focus has been on social sciences, where the impact is achieved through information and policy channels, and the impact is perhaps more a function of well-being at an economic and society level. Governments, of course, have grappled with these issues for many years. In many respects, SoERC itself is an institutional response to this question of translation and impact. The CRC program has been with us for many years and has evolved as a structure to drive collaboration between research and industry. The ARC linkage program is another example. And just last week, the Commonwealth announced a new Trailblazer University program that addresses both research priorities and commercialisation. But I would contend overall, though, that the focus in most of this work is on commercialisation, which is only part of the issue. It's not nearly as focused on the social sciences. The variables have always included incentives, obligations, program funding, institutions, and indeed culture of both research doers and research users. ACOLA has looked at some international examples to see if there are any lessons there on how Australia might do better. Germany is currently working in its 7th energy research plan. And in the UK, there has been a long-standing research and innovation energy program. Both these national models have mature institutional structures, but they operate in specific economic and social contexts that may or may not translate well to Australia. So ACOLA has been considering what recommendations we might make regarding translation of energy research. And these would be recommendations to research funders, to researchers, and to research users in areas such as information sharing, alignment with research priorities, and on research translation plans and incentives. Our current work suggests that a central recommendation might revolve around the accessibility of research outcomes for research users. And here we're looking at modelling a program on that quite mature model of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and its assessment reports and summaries for policymakers. This audience would be aware that the IPCC, which undertakes periodic assessments summarising the state of scientific knowledge, and then prepares summary reports to guide policymakers, all through a panel of independent expert authors. Indeed, our next speaker, Mark Howden, is one of those authors. How could that model be adapted to the Australian energy transition? Well, a synthesis report, say every 2 years, prepared by an expert panel, could describe what we know for sure about the energy transition, what we don't know, and what are the major uncertainties where more research is needed, and produce summaries as guidance for government, for industry and community in the language that those audiences need. Such an enterprise would require an authoritative convening body. It would require some funding, and it would definitely require robust governance to ensure the integrity of the assessments and the synthesis. But those problems are, I think, all solvable. So ACOLA's work on recommendations for energy research translation is nearly completed. We're just undertaking a final consultation and editing stage on that now. I'd like to talk about the next steps in the ACOLA work. First, we need to finalise those 5 papers that I've just outlined, the 3 reviews, our funding analysis, and our translation recommendations. And we need to communicate those 5 papers in a coherent way. Our aim is to get to that stage by the end of February 22. Pretty confident we can get the review papers and the translation by then. The funding paper, though, we're dependent on country reports to the International Energy Agency. When we've published those 5 papers, together with our first paper, that will complete the first major analytical stage of our work on the Australian Energy Transition Research Plan. However, we're very conscious that there are still some big issues to address. Firstly, we haven't yet tackled the structure of the Australian energy research community itself. The universities, that is, the research institutes that are members of ERICA, CSIRO, ARENA, the ARC, the NH&MRC, the CRCs, and so on and so on. That architecture or structure, how that might be developed and optimised to enhance research for the energy transition is, I think, a research question in its own right. Second, we'd always intended that we'd undertake a bottom-up audit of who is doing what in energy research in Australia and indeed internationally as it relates to Australian research questions, to complement our first top-down report on research priorities. That's a large body of work also, but if we're able to orchestrate the synthesis reports, the assessment and synthesis reports that I outlined, then that process may address most of that need of an audit of who is doing what. And finally, of course, the priority research questions will, indeed they must, evolve as the energy transition itself unfolds over time. It's a very dynamic research environment. Finally, our steering committee is turning its mind to what we need to do to increase the impact of our own work on the Australian Energy Transition Research Plan. And we'll be engaging back with our academies and with our project sponsors in thinking through what is the best use of ACOLA resources and our sponsors' funding over this next period. So, to come back to the opening, what is the state of the Australian Energy Transition Research Plan? Are we indeed yet accelerating energy research in Australia? Well, I would argue that the engagement that we have done, the conversations that we've had across the energy research community has certainly deepened the conversation about the research agenda in Australia. I think we've made good progress on identifying priority research questions and highlighting the gaps in the current research agenda, and if you like, both the strengths and weaknesses of what we're currently doing in Australia. Our funding and translation papers should round out this analytical phase of our work and provide what I hope will be a quite compelling narrative about energy research policy and the state of energy research in Australia. ACOLA's next challenge will then be our own focus, how we scale up our work and how we translate our own efforts for greater impact on the research community, the funders of research, the doers of research, and the users of research. And of course, that's exactly what we're saying to you, the energy research community. So we must do, as we're saying to you, the researchers. We must focus, we must scale up, and we must translate. Ariel, thank you again for the opportunity to present this update on our research plan. And I look forward to the questions, and I look forward to the ongoing engagement with the research community. Back to you.
Much, Drew. That's a fantastic opportunity to really progress the research agenda towards the energy transition. I think it's really heartening that ACOLA and the government is supporting ACOLA and its member academies in actually taking this to another level. So thank you, Drew. And I think no further ado for some Q&A. We actually have a few minutes up our sleeve, extra 5 or 10 minutes. So I encourage people to get in there and post their questions on the live Q&A chat. And at the moment, I'm not seeing too many questions. So perhaps people can, feel free to be perhaps a little bit pointed and controversial, just to get some perhaps interesting discussion. I'm trying to emulate as much as possible a real conference where there's a lot of toing and froing. It's a bit hard, I know, in these online platforms, but it would be nice to get some conversation. Looks like, if I'm not mistaken, there aren't too many questions just yet, or any. Maybe I'll pitch in and ask one question for Drew. Is that okay, Drew?
Absolutely. I'd be disappointed if you didn't, Ariel.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'm unlikely to be disappointed knowing me in this case. So one question is about sort of, I guess, the rate of the change in this research funding environment. How do you see you and the team there and the ecosystem around you being able to get this sorted out fast enough to actually influence the dynamics of this transition, which is happening very fast? There's two sort of timeframes that come to mind. One of them is net, 50% emission reduction by 2030 is the 1.5 degree target, if not the Australia's current policy, while the other time frame is, at least from a techno-economic perspective, is the high levels of penetration of wind and solar will lead AEMO to have some challenges by 2025 around grid stability and security if things go as forecast. So how do we get all the timeframes working? I'd note that the theme of this conference is accelerating research for a speedy energy transition. So everything needs to be accelerated. So if you
Ariel, let me come at that through three examples, and I'm just noting. First of all, the power system engineering challenge, which I know is one that you and several of our university research groups are focused on, and is obviously very close to my heart at the AEMO level. The challenge that Daniel Westerman, our new CEO at AEMO, has set of being able to operate the grid as a whole, the NEM as a whole, and the same challenge will be for our West Australian colleagues in the SWIS at periods of 100% instantaneous renewable energy by just 2025 is a startlingly urgent challenge. And we see the records being broken in South Australia regularly already just in these last few months. I'm quite optimistic that the engineers will be able to keep pace with that challenge against the performance indicator of keeping the lights on, which is the one that AEMO is, of course, highly focused on. But it's going to get ahead of that to where we're operating an entirely net zero emission energy system in Australia is going to need a lot more power system engineering over the next decade or two. I mean, an example that is called out in the GPST program, how we manage system restarts in the unhappy event that we have a system black, is a non-trivial problem. What sort of control room technologies we need at AEMO to keep doing it is significant. And how are we going to orchestrate the variable generation and variable load and storage, deep and shallow, are all significant engineering challenges. But I'm pretty optimistic about that. Second is around markets. And again, both the West Australian market and the NEM are undergoing major periods, major programs of market reform. They feel like they're barely keeping pace with the rate of transition. And I think there is a real opportunity in the research sector to contribute more to the questions about the speed of reform in energy markets. And as sector coupling develops, the transport sector in particular, I think we're going to be really challenged in terms of our market designs and regulations. But I've saved the biggest to last, which is social license. Because having the right technologies, having a market design that is fit for purpose, are both necessary but not sufficient conditions for a successful transition. We must have a social license for the stuff we have to build and the way in which we have to operate it, and for the stuff that we have to close down and replace. And that is the area where I think Australia is under-invested in research and indeed in policy. I know there is some good, very good researchers working in this area, but the scale of our research effort, I don't think anywhere near matches the significance of the questions around social license. So I think research in technology is ramping up, and that's welcome, that's great. I don't yet see a shift in the research agenda around policy and regulation or around social license.
Thank you, Drew. There's a few other questions in the chat that I think are now starting to come through that I can now see if the team have started any. No, and just bear with me a bit. Some of this writing is a bit small. Oh, there's a very good question for you, Drew, that's bubbled up to the top of the list with the thumbs ups. Do we need to revisit the standard for keeping the lights on? Is it currently set at too strict a level? Now, that's a good question, but perhaps not quite a question for the theme of your presentation. But Drew, if you feel like answering that one or answering something about it, that would be quite interesting.
That's a great question. And it's the sort of question, you know, that I think is a perfectly proper research question, Ariel, in its own right. So the current reliability standards and the expectation around system security and reliability are indeed those that were established pre-energy transition. So I think it's a proper question and not one that should just get a trite off-the-cuff response, but, because I think it's worth a lot of consideration. But I'll sort of give a perspective from where I sit wearing my AEMO hat. You know, one of the things that is quite clear in energy transition writ large is a term that my colleague Alan Finkel likes to use: the future is electric. There'll be a lot more stuff, a lot more economic and social activity that is electrified in the future than there is at the moment. And in a even more electric economy and society that we have now, my sense at the moment is that community expectations are that the lights will be on, electricity will be secure and reliable, essentially 24/7, and that the operators of the system will only be forgiven in the face of natural disasters, bushfires, cyclones, floods, etc. Now, there's a whole narrative, of course, that you could go there about the frequency and severity of such events in a changing climate. But the fundamental point is, I think Australians will expect the same sorts of levels of reliability and security as they have enjoyed in, you know, the last several decades. It'll just be delivered in a very different way. And the challenge that the operator is taking on is to maintain those standards with a net zero emission system.
Great, thank you, Drew. Just interesting game here, trying to keep up with all the different questions in the chat. And now I'd say some folks have raised their hand, and unfortunately we can't actually easily take audio questions because the bandwidth is not guaranteed. So whoever wanted to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A or the discussion forum. There was somebody quite early on, so I'm happy to prioritize that in the chat. In the meantime, I'll go to Kelly Burns' question. can Drew please repeat where we can find his analysis on the recent IEA data, if there is indeed such a place we can find it, Drew?
The International Energy Agency itself has the data on member country energy R&D. So you'll have to search for that, but I'd start with iea.org, and it's somewhere on the IEA website. So it is a public report that the IEA produces. What the ACOLA project will do early next year, after that IEA data set is updated, is we'll publish a specific analysis on Australia against comparator countries and try and unpack some of those structural issues about what it is that we are reporting in the Australian data, and indeed what is being reported in some of the other country data, to try, to the extent possible, compare apples with apples. As I mentioned, Ariel, in my remarks, my sense, and I used to be Australia's member on the governing board of the International Energy Agency, my sense from my time at the IEA is that there are significant structural differences in the way member countries report R&D data. And what ACOLA will be attempting to do is to get behind those structural differences and try and really tease out how Australia rates against others.
Okay, great. Thank you, Drew. I guess the general answer is that this is still an ongoing analysis, and once you do release your analyses, we will have sort of one place where we can look on the ACOLA website or similar. Is that right?
Correct.
Great. And so I've got another question. I think this is a very good one. So which was from one of the held up hands, which we fortunately couldn't take. It's from David Hill. You mentioned fragmented research effort. We now have one wide area physical, economic, social system. We know David, he's a control engineer, so he's using that sort of language, which I tend to do as well. And that system is granulated from the NEM to households with different research foci all over. How do we coordinate?
Indeed. Great question. And as I said in my remarks, I think that is a research question in its own right, but it's a public policy research question. And, you know, I think it's interesting, Ariel, to run the thought experiment that if you could sit there with a blank sheet of paper and design the Australian energy research effort to align with the priorities for the energy transition, would you have 12 university energy research institutes, a CSIRO energy business unit, half a dozen CRCs, an ARENA, a CFC, etc., an ARC with this, that, and the other, and so on and so on and so on. You know, this is fragmented, and all of which operate without. While ACOLA's work, of course, we call it the Energy Transition Research Plan. It's a recommendation. It doesn't have executive authority. No one is required to respond to it. We're attempting to persuade and influence. So I think David's question it is in fact one of our 27 research questions. How can we optimize the organisation, the institutional organisation and collaboration across all of those current research teams? So we don't have the luxury of a blank sheet of paper. That's probably a good problem because there's a lot of good work to have, but we certainly have the opportunity to improve the way in which we work together. And we, ACOLA, will be putting some of that, referring to that certainly in terms of priority research funding in our research translation recommendations that we'll publish early next year.
Great. Thanks, Drew. And given we're ahead of time, we've got time for two more questions. And we have two very good questions here that we've highlighted. One is from Utkarsha. And what do you reckon will be the most crucial steps to achieve the significant impact that, I'm paraphrasing here a bit, that you've indicated we want to be able to have through this plan? And how does ACOLA aim to measure these impacts?
Look, great questions. Right now, given what we've already done and the work that we're about to publish on literature review, funding and translation, my sense, and this isn't yet the ACOLA line, I have to, but my personal view at this stage is that the single most impactful thing that ACOLA could sponsor or attempt to orchestrate would be this assessment report and summary for energy research users that I talked about, modelled on the IPCC SPM process. That is to say, if we can make a step change in the way in which research users can access Australian and relevant international research and increase that linkage between the people that do the research and the people that can use it, if we can improve that linkage, I think we could, that's potentially the key to unlock a bigger shift in this whole research plan project. How do we measure success? Again, a very good public policy question. We're looking to shift the dial on whether or not the priority research questions that we have had, that we have published based on consultation, are in fact receiving funding, and the research is being undertaken and it is being translated. So we're looking at that metrics about who's doing what and who's using it. So hard to have a pure counterfactual in that assessment. This is a problem that I'm very familiar with from a CSIRO perspective. But I think there are techniques for measuring impact of this kind of work that we can draw on.
Thank you, Drew. That's very helpful. And then we have one more question. This is a really good one. I like this one a lot. It's from Heather Smith. The network businesses, I assume Heather means the distribution network companies primarily, but also maybe the transmission network operators, own an awful lot of research capacity. They are obligated to engage. Research tend to be completely different parts of their business and utilize different expertise. How do we get these very technical experts across the energy sector to understand and value the integration of social sciences in particular? But I think we can also ask this over the whole sector. How do we work with the R&D, innovation parts of these businesses?
Yeah, look, that's a great question from Heather too, Ariel. And it really highlights the point that energy research is much more than the research done in Australian universities or, plus CSIRO. It's much more than that which is done within the ERICA framework. When we were consulting on the research plan, we engaged directly with industry around this. My sense is that there is a real appetite for industry to support a greater focus on energy research. But of course, Heather's question is more, how do we influence industry to do more research themselves to inform what they're doing, if I understood it correctly. And I think the example around social license, which I know folk that are following the development of transmission in Victoria will be very familiar with, is perhaps a real case study in this. So to me, when I said that ACOLA needs to get better at communicating and its own work on research plan, that engagement with industry is important. We need to, it's all very well to be giving a keynote address at a conference of researchers, but let's get to the point where we're giving a keynote address at the conference of the Energy Networks Association and talking to the boards of those network businesses. So that's part of the challenge in front of us for ACOLA, to make sure that our own work is not just reverberating in the echo chamber of energy researchers, but is actually getting out into industry, or university researchers, but is getting out into industry, community and government.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Drew. That's really good timing. We're 10 seconds over time. So I think we actually, within the experimental error, being a physicist, I'll just say we're on time. And so I'd like to thank you very much for your address, Drew, and we're very keen to work closely with you here at ERICA, as I know you are, to find a way to connect the worlds together of government, industry, and the research community to make this the work impact in the short term. And and so thank you very much, Drew, again for your time. I hope you'll stay for some, if not all, of the sessions today week. In a lot of ways, I should mention that Drew, you and Ken, but particularly you were very keen. You were egging us on to make sure we have this conference and make sure that we got the community together to talk about transition. And I think that's been an incredibly important and heartening, actually, conversation to have, to know that somebody in your role is valuing the research community and valuing engagement with it. So I don't think I can overstate how important it's been, at least for me. So thank you very much for that. And then we will now have a short pause, and that explanatory speaker is Professor Mark Howden, the Director of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at the ANU, and Mark will be providing us a climate science update with implications for the energy transition. So, you know, perhaps in some ways from a technical perspective, this is possibly the most important talk at this conference, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Professor Mark Howden. So yeah, we'll see you in about 3 minutes.